Hi, good evening.
Hi, good evening, Mariah. How are you?
I'm great.
Good. I have had some messages trickling in from some of our members, and I think we have a few folks who are going to join late, including
Okay.
Adrielle, your co-chair, and I also saw Grace, Sonia, Mignana, and Aaron would not be able to join.
Okay.
So would you want to just go ahead and let me know when you would like to kick it off? I'm just gonna in the background make sure that my slideshow's ready, but Mariah, if you want to let me know when you feel like we're ready, that
Yeah. Well, let's give this about 3 minutes and we can start. We've got the kind of our housekeeping items here and we can go through those and give that a couple of minutes because we can always review that in email. So welcome everyone. I see that we're just joining. We're going to give folks a couple of minutes here as they're joining the meeting and we'll get started here shortly. We'll kind of review our schedule and then go into, we'll hear about maintenance here in a while.
Hello, can you hear me? Hi, Caitlin. Yes, we can hear you.
Okay, I just wanted to share. I am on my way home now, so I won't be able to speak for most of the time as I'm about to get on the bus, and I might have to hop off at some point once I get home to get on my laptop. So if you see me coming in and out, just that's the reason. I just wanted to clarify before we start.
Understood, Caitlin. Thank you for letting us know. And thank you for being here.
Yeah, it looks like it's 5:34 and I know folks are still going to be joining, but let's go ahead and get started. We can begin with kind of just our housekeeping items. This is Mariah Hudson speaking. I'm your chair. Thank you. And Alexandra, any housekeeping items that we want to go over kind of first before we dive into schedule here?
Yep, we do have a few housekeeping items. Thank you so much for kicking this off, Mariah. Um, I wanted to let folks know that I've linked to our questions and answers document. So we have recorded at this point already more than a dozen questions from CBRC that have been registered really early in our process. And so that's really helpful for staff as we start to process through those questions. And we understand that those are critical for you as you're formulating your budget review. And so our goal is to have as many of those questions answered as possible by the April 24th meeting. and possibly earlier. So when we do have, a set of questions that have been responded to, we'll send those out to you so that you can start to digest them and consider if you have any follow-ups prior to April 24th. So I wanted to state that, and thank you so much for your patience while we work through those. And I had stated in our prior meeting, but some of the responses that we have for those are dependent on some of the next steps in our internal process to analyze data, validate data, and finally formulate the proposed budget. So some of them are kind of pending some information, and then others we can answer now. As an example, we heard that there was an interest in hearing about maintenance, facilities, and transportation, and thus we have Dan Young, our Chief Operating Officer, here. So we'll be working through those. And our agenda will focus on, like I stated, a facilities and maintenance focus with our COO, Dan Young, and then we'll provide some budget development updates. The only other housekeeping item I have for tonight are upcoming milestones. I'm going to walk through these so we all have these dates in mind and on our calendar. So we have a tentative date to have the budget document out to this group. There, like I'm saying, that is tentative. So we're ideally going to have this publicly available on April 21st. That's a Monday. Our superintendent, Dr. Armstrong, will be releasing her proposed budget on April 22nd, Tuesday, within the regular board meeting, and CBRC would be welcome to attend, but your attendance is optional in that space. And our next regular CBRC meeting is April 24th. We will host this meeting on Zoom. And at that time, you'll have the budget documents. You'll also have the local option levy reporting. And then, like I stated, the response to your questions will also be available. And I am proposing a couple of dates right now for our report writing. So we have typically engaged in a group report creation sessions once we have those budget documents. So I'm proposing Monday, April 28th, and I'm also proposing Thursday, May 1st for report writing sessions. I think no need to give me feedback right now on those dates. I'm going to go ahead and follow up in an email. And if you have any feedback for me before we solidify those dates, just let me know, and I can try to look at something else if possible. If it sounds like, oh, Maria, go ahead.
I do want to say, with the timeline for getting our recommendations to the board, I really look at that May 1st Thursday work session as being, kind of just polishing whatever recommendations we have at that point. So finessing language, but really pretty much having the meat of it together at that point.
Yes. And Mariah, I was hoping, this isn't a full committee conversation, but just for awareness, I was hoping that you and I and Adrielle could connect and talk through how you would like to proceed this year in terms of some of the logistics and how we come together.
Absolutely. If you have anything further to say on this, and then I have one housekeeping item as well related.
Okay, perfect. Yep, just going to flag these other couple of dates. So this is as an FYI, there's a public comment session and budget work session that's scheduled for Tuesday, April 29th. There was a date change there. So I just wanted to make sure that folks registered that in case you had recorded it on your calendar. And this is optional for CBRC. And then we're tracking towards May 6th within the regular board meeting to present the CBRC report. Mariah, go ahead.
One of the things I wanted to mention that's a responsibility of our committee is reviewing the levy numbers. So the levy supports FTE, so positions in our schools, teachers essentially, mostly, and we review how that money has been spent as one of the duties of the CBRC. I have done that in a past year, and given, kind of chairing this committee rather than just co-chairing, I would like to offer that as something that one of our committee members could take on. It's not particularly extensive. Staff does a good job preparing those numbers, and it's reviewing those, but it's really important because it is presented to the board, and it's it's our duty to the public to ensure that those dollars are being spent as they were intended. So of course we'll talk with Adriel, co-chair, about this as well. But it would be a great way for someone or a couple of people to step up if they'd like to have the experience and jump in and review that. I would say it's, an hour, maybe a couple of hours to participate and to review the levy numbers.
Mariah, I don't mind reviewing. This is Deshelle.
Fantastic. Thank you so much.
You're welcome.
And I'd be happy to talk with you and prior to getting that. And staff, I'm sure, will as well.
Okay, great. Yeah, we can, I think, well, I have your email, so we can just email about when to meet. Thank you.
Fantastic.
Thank you. Mariah, was there anything else you'd want to name on timeline or any other housekeeping items that were on your mind that we haven't covered?
So just in terms of timeline, I will say, I think we've mentioned it's pretty quick once we get the budget. I think we can talk in the next, our next meeting really is kind of that April 20. No, we have another meeting before then, before April 21st, correct?
We have, we'll have 3 more meetings. So
that's right. Thank you.
Right. April 24th, and that's when you will have the documents.
Thank you. I'm sorry, I don't have my calendar in front of me. So I think it's important that we outline our priorities that we're going to look for in the budget prior to getting the superintendent's budget on the 21st, so that we can then go into the budget and look for how those are being, enacted. So what I'm really saying is our priorities, it's comparing to the board's priorities. So the board has set out their priorities and looking at how the budget reflects or doesn't reflect, or what questions we have. A lot of times it really is about the questions that we have for the superintendent or for the board in these budgets. So in terms of the timeline, again, April 21st, I will certainly be at the presentation on the 22nd. That's a great chance. And if you can't be there in person, watching that online, it's where board members start to ask those questions. And there's the presentation of what's in the budget, why those decisions were made, that the superintendent Armstrong is presenting and has put together the budget in this particular way. So I don't see any need to kind of start pre-writing or anything like that until we've really heard from the superintendent. But then, we will be kind of fast and furious. And I encourage people to think about, if, third grade reading metrics are something that you really care about, or special education is something that you want to look at. If there's a particular area you want to put eyes on and maybe take as a section of our work as it relates to those board goals. That would be a great way to participate in this process. And I will be the one to kind of help put arms around it and put things together and help us get together to a final set of recommendations. Can I open this for questions? Okay, well, I'm sure we will have more as we as we get further into this process.
I'm sure we will. Thank you, Mariah. I am happy to pass it over now to Dan Young, who's our Chief Operating Officer. Dan, we were hoping that you could introduce yourself and your area, a huge part of our organization. And thank you so much for being here tonight.
Happy to do that, and thanks for having me. Again, my name is Dan Young, Chief Operating Officer at Portland Public Schools. Within the Office of Operation, there are 8 departments, which include the real estate and facilities teams, the construction teams, and student transportation, which is why I think I was invited tonight. We have just a few slides that provide an overview of information that I understand the committee is interested in, so I'll just quickly run through them. And please feel free to stop me with questions as we go along. I'll do my best to answer all of them. And if any of my colleagues, Alexandra or anyone, have anything to add, or if I just missed anything, feel feel free to just jump in and fill in the gaps. So let's start on the building side. PPS owns a lot of property, which is probably not a surprise. As noted here, PPS owns over 700 acres across 100 sites, over 200 individual buildings totaling about 9 million square feet. PPS also owns a lot of old buildings. The average age of a PPS school is about 75 years old, and we have 20 that were built more than 100 years ago. The two teams that are primarily tasked with regular maintenance and repair are the custodial maintenance teams. There's just some data here about those teams and about their budgets. The maintenance team has 77 technicians grouped into 3 different shops. That's how we manage their work. And their primary task is responding to work orders. Last year, we had over 17,000 work orders that were issued, and that equates to something like 66, I think, per working day. And our custodial team includes over 300 staff, of which almost all are school-based staff, so they're assigned to one site. And their combined budgets between the two is about $47.5 million. So is there any, I know that's over, we'll get into a little more detail, but is there any questions? I'll pause before I move on.
So Dan, can I just ask, kind of what's the difference between, I'm thinking back to the winter storms of a year ago.
Mm-hmm.
What's the difference between kind of a maintenance issue that's taken care of, at the school site as a part of what just happens, drains flood, things happen,
Mm-hmm.
and what's something that's kind of above and beyond that then is either, an incident or people are brought in or funded by the district?
That's a great question. So if there is an item that needs to be resolved, if there is a toilet that's clogged, we'll do something simple like that. That will generate a work order, and that will go to our maintenance team. And they will go and they will dispatch and they will try to resolve that issue. If the cause of that issue ends up being something more significant, let's say that there is, it's the main line that runs to the street that needs to be repaired, that has failed, that needs to be repaired. And so it's not something that's within the capability of that team that would normally be completed within a day or two. That then goes to the construction side of the house. And then they will assign a project manager to respond to that work. So our construction teams manage projects, really big and small, from $100 projects or even volunteer $0 projects to projects that are 9 figures or more, hundreds of millions of dollars. So does that answer your question? I don't want to ramble too far if I'm heading off in the wrong direction.
Yeah, I think that gives me a good baseline.
Okay, great. Well, let's jump over to the next slide and we'll talk about capital. I know there was some interest in the district's capital needs and capital improvements. So it's probably no surprise to this group that PPS has significant capital needs. And when we talk about capital, we often break them down into these 3 categories you see here that I think kind of help makes the topic a little more manageable, because it's a really big topic. So if you break it down to little chunks, I think it makes it a little easier to understand. Excuse me. The first I'll talk about is deferred maintenance, which are building assets that are past their useful life or just simply broken. Capital renewal, which are building assets that will soon be past their useful life or anticipated to be soon. And then physical facility improvements, which are projects that improve a school's built environment, but that do not address existing facility conditions. And I'll walk through each one of those. If we want to move on to the next, please. So let's start with deferred maintenance. Estimating total deferred maintenance for organizations as big as PPS is pretty challenging. We talked about we have 100 sites and we have tens of thousands of building assets that are constantly aging and dynamic and are changing. So the data that we have around deferred maintenance, just think of it as high level and approximate. And we've got a couple footnotes on the slide that I won't read that kind of give you like the sense of level of how we estimate our deferred maintenance backlog. But quickly, in 2021, PPS completed a third-party facility condition assessment that looked at all the district schools with the exceptions of the ones that were under construction, new modernization projects. And that team assessed over 15,000 individual building assets. And the district's portfolio condition is range is, of course, very broad, with some schools being very aged and need a significant repair, others having received improvements in recent years from recent geo bonds, and others that are basically brand new. But when you look at the totality, the average of PPS's facilities is considered poor when you do the math for the facility condition index. Next one, please, Alexandra. In addition and separate from capital or from deferred maintenance is capital renewal. So the systems buildings continue to age all the time, of course. And so the way that we estimate capital renewal, again, is very high level. The APPA is an organization that provides this high level rule of thumb to budget 3% of current replacement value for capital renewal project. And that equates for PPS to about $170 million a year, which another way to say that is just to maintain current status, the district should be budgeting roughly $170 million a year. And then we'll talk about the third one, which is physical facility improvements. This third category are projects that improve the facility but do not address those existing building systems. So a couple of simple examples are adding a playground or an elevator. Those improve the building or improve the facility, but they don't address, deferred maintenance or other capital renewal. So physical facility projects can be generated from a number of different sources, but one of the primary ones that we use at PPS and that we use when we're looking at bond planning is the district's long-range facility plan, which identifies future built environment goals and a vision for a number of different program areas that are listed here, but I won't read them all, but like athletics, security services, and special education. And on the slide are some examples of what those high priority physical facility improvements are for those different scopes of work. And then if we go to the next slide, we'll talk about capital funding sources. Deferred maintenance, capital renewal, and facility improvements outline that we just talked about outline the district's capital needs, but how do we align those with the resources? The biggest one by far is general obligation bonds. PPS last passed a bond in 2020 for a little over $1.2 billion, and voters are going to consider another bond in May of this year for a little over $1.8 billion. So that is the primary source to address the district's capital needs. But there are other sources of revenue. Annually, we receive revenue from the City of Portland's construction excise tax. Although this revenue is a bit unpredictable year to year, it's definitely supports the capital needs that we have, especially those that are outside of the language of the general obligation bonds. PPS property leases and permits also provide funding, as do grants. And so we pursue a number of different grants on a regular basis. Two examples of some significant ones are Portland's Clean Energy Fund, which focuses on greenhouse gas emission type improvements, and the state's seismic rehabilitation grant program. Maybe I'll pause there because I think we're going to go to a little bit different topic, but are there questions about capital?
Yeah, I have a quick question. How does this relate to like the budget shortfall that we have? And how does this relate to that?
That is a great question. This equates to the general fund has some resources for capital improvements. So like the construction excise tax will come through the general fund. That's revenue that is allocated to capital projects. Lease revenue is another one that will be allocated to the teams to address capital projects, whether those be deferred maintenance, capital renewal, or physical facility improvements. The general obligation bond is also included. If we have a bond, for example, the bond that's already passed, that is included in the district's budget. But the budget for the district's annual budget doesn't include the totality of the bonds. It includes the amount that is estimated to be spent that following fiscal year. I feel like I stumbled through that a little bit, but I hope that was
Yeah, just a follow-up. I know the the union in their contract has a lot to do with like maintenance and facility upgrades and things of that nature. this as it relates to their condition, work condition. Does this kind of tie into that as well, or is this something separate?
I think it does. And let me answer this, and if this answer doesn't hit exactly what your question, a part of the most recent agreement with the teachers union is allocating capital to certain types of improvements. And so there's two portions of that come to mind. There might be more, but two. And one is around PSEF grant funding. And so there's language that those PSEF funds should go towards, of course, what the goal of the PSEF funds are, which is greenhouse gas emissions, and also temperature improvements. So capital improvements that are temperature improvements in the school, and those overlap, and those are included in these capital fund sources. If that makes sense. It's a little wordy.
Yeah, that does. So has those things been kind of taken care of? Will we have enough funds to be able to meet the needs of the contract?
Great question. We will meet the requirements of the contract. Much of it is still ongoing. So the PSEF awards, there's two different PSEF groups. There's a direct allocation and there's a grant that PPS was part of a consortium. That work is underway, and it's honestly, most of it's just getting started. And I think it has 5 years for us to complete all of that work. So it has some early administrative requirements where we submit the types of projects, then the city of Portland approves those projects, then we go out and need to execute that work. So the work is ongoing, but really it's just starting.
Okay, thank you.
Yep.
Director Sullivan, do you have a question or comment?
Yes, I had a question about the CTE tax. It said last year's it was 1.7 million, but it averages 6 to 7 million per year. Is there any reason why it was so low last year?
It's a great question. Pre-pandemic, the average was roughly about $6 to $7 million per year. Since 2020, it's been going down. Last year, it was particularly low. I am not a construction excise tax expert, so I don't know if there's somebody here who wants to jump on, but essentially when there are building permits that are submitted to the city of Portland for property that is within PPS's boundary, a portion of those fees are administered via this construction excise tax. That revenue is then provided to PPS, and that comes in. I'm not sure if it comes in quarterly or how it comes in, but it's all dependent upon the permits that come in, and that is the revenue that we get. So sometimes it is hard to predict how much we're going to get in a given year.
So it was just a bad building year.
It was a low, yes.
Okay.
Building starts were down.
Okay, thank you.
Mhm.
Maria, feel free to jump in.
I know this is a little outside of the capital improvements that are happening, but I'm curious, when we did an assessment of kind of our maintenance at 2021, is there any sense of what it would cost to regulate the HVAC in buildings, our existing buildings, such that they could be climate controlled, for instance, air conditioned, so that we don't have heat days where children miss school?
That is a great question. So air conditioning is, so PPSs, I think we have about a dozen schools that have centralized air conditioning in it now, of our roughly 80 some schools. The most effective way to provide air conditioning is to have a system-wide air conditioning mechanical system. Those are very expensive to install. So those take significant capital dollars. We don't have an estimate. We could put together a high estimate of what that would do district-wide, and we do pursue in recent years. We have completed HVAC upgrades that include air conditioning, and when you do an upgrade like that, it also triggers a number of other building system upgrade requirements. That's a part of the reasons why they become so expensive. But to provide centralized air conditioning throughout the district would be extremely expensive and would take a significant amount of time. They're very invasive projects.
Well, would that be part of the teacher union contract though, of work conditions?
I'm probably not the best one to speak on the language of the contract, but the contract doesn't require air conditioning. It has language around if there are temperatures that exceed or go below, what the reaction is in that instance.
Got it. Okay.
With the school modernization projects, is air conditioning a part of those projects?
Yes, they are. All of our modernized schools have air conditioning in them, and they'll continue to do that. Just kind of as an interesting aside, 20 years ago, even 10 years ago, it was a discussion if new schools would include air conditioning in Oregon. You know, climate was considered temperate. Most schools didn't operate in the summer. You can find schools that were built within the last 20 years, not at PPS, but in the area that do not include air conditioning. No longer is that the case. All modernized PPS schools have air conditioning. Okay, we want to move on. There's, I think, 2 more slides, and if we want to come back to any of these, happy to do that as well. I think there are a couple questions about PPS's real estate outside of maintenance and facilities. As we know, PPS owns a lot of property. The majority of the district sites are used for schools and or administrative purposes, but PPS owns also owns a handful of properties that are leased or provided to third-party partners. The district also owns 3 buildings that are not currently used. They're listed here. One is currently marketed for lease. Another is being held at the moment in case it is needed by other PPS programs in the near future, but that may be an opportunity, a lease opportunity in the future as well. And then the third is a school that's been closed for quite some time, and it's in a dilapidated condition and is effectively shuttered. The cost to maintain these, I think was one of the questions, isn't significant, pretty nominal. We have nominal utilities. We do need to respond to vandalism sometimes. We carry insurance for those sites, but those total costs are generally pretty low. And the last slide I'll finish up and then answer any outstanding questions is about transportation. Our transportation team consists of a mix of PPS staff, including PPS employed bus drivers and contracted services. So we transport about 10,000 students each day. We drive over 3 million miles each year. The way we transport students impacts costs pretty significantly. The big buses that you see are the most cost effective. The smaller buses are more costly, but still generally cost effective, whereas the specialized individual transportation has the highest cost per student. So as you can imagine, what our teams are continually working to place students in the most cost-effective mode of transportation that meets each student's needs and what the requirements are for each one of those students. The transportation budget exceeds 40 million, though I want to note here that the vast majority, almost all of transportation's costs are eligible for reimbursement for the Oregon Department of Education at 70%. So we submit our costs once a year to the state, and then they reimburse all eligible costs at 70%. And then there's one specific note that at the beginning of this current school year, PPS aligned our school type bell schedules across the district, which helped out our transportation pretty significantly, effectively allowing our assets, our vehicles, to run more routes and creating more significant efficiencies, each asset to be able to service more schools. So, and we estimate that change saved about $2 million. And I think that's the end of my slides, but happy to answer questions.
Michelle, do you want to jump in?
Sure. Thank you for the presentation. On the transportation slide, just given the rising costs and recent service challenges, how is PPS approaching the long-term sustainability and equity in its transportation budget, especially for students in undisturbed or geographically isolated areas? Thank you.
That's a great question. You know, we transport all of our students, and where we have challenging areas, sometimes we have areas that require longer service. What we try to do is add additional routes that reduce that route time. That can add costs, but we're but we're always looking to maintain that high level of service. It's an interesting balance with transportation is if we see an area where the routes are running longer, whether it be by traffic or other unexpected situations, because our routes change every year, what we do is we add routes, and that adds cost, but it's an improvement to that student. So we're always balancing that.
I had a follow-up, sorry, just to that one.
Sure.
So when thinking about kind of like how you're thinking about solving this outside of the additional routes, are you thinking of any other like innovative strategies around like different types of transportation, like electric or different ways that we're using the public transit? Because I know you said like transport all students, but there's still a lot of students who don't get transported in or can't, that's not an option for them. They've got to travel a little bit further to get into the school. So I'm kind of just trying to get to that question about like how is there a plan in place to get to the point where transportation isn't a barrier for any student in the PPS school district?
It's a good question, and maybe I'm not sure if there's a specific instance. PPS does provide transportation to all students that meet the transportation requirements. If you live within a certain radius of the school and you don't have a special transportation augmentation, walking or traveling other than PPS transportation is the service. We provide for our high school students, we provide TriMet passes, we provide buses, of course, we provide specialized transportation door to door for many of our students, and we also are looking to electrify our fleet. That's another way. Capital I didn't include in here because it wasn't related to the buildings, but we regularly pursue grants for our buses to electrify our fleet, and we're doing that basically every year. We're slowly adding more and more to our fleet.
Thank you.
Caitlin, you had your hand up.
Yeah, my question is actually about TriMet, which you just mentioned. I was just wondering, with this number 41 million, does that include what we pay to TriMet for those passes? And do you know what percentage of that tends to go to TriMet? Or how much we usually pay for those passes at least?
The budget does include the TriMet passes. I don't know what that total is offhand. I'll have to follow up with that. We have that data, of course. I just don't know offhand.
Mariah, go ahead.
Yeah, I have questions on a couple of the slides here. I'll start with transportation. First, I wanted to ask what percentage of your fleet is contracted versus owned by PPS?
It's roughly 2/3 contracted to 1/3 PPS. All of our big buses, our general transportation buses, are provided through our contracted services. Our shorter buses or other vehicles, our vans and cars that we call our ST or specialized transportation, that's a mix between PPS staff and contracted services.
Okay. And you mentioned there's 70% reimbursement by the Oregon Department of Education on a lot of these transportation costs. So I wanted to ask about that savings of $2 million. That was a big deal for a lot of families in the change with school times. And with the staggering of school times, tell me, where is that savings? Is that savings to PPS after the 70%? Is that $2 million on their 30%, or is that $2 million total?
That estimate was a gross savings to the transportation budget. So net savings would be 70% of that.
And just for the committee, the reason I'm asking on this is as we think about, student success metrics and especially chronic absenteeism, we know that particularly high schoolers do better with later start times, just biologically. So that is one of the things that's kind of on my mind, thinking about the alignment of busing schedules. Does anybody else have transportation questions before I move on to other questions?
Caitlin, you still have your hand up. Is that from the question you just asked?
Yes, sorry, I forgot to put it down.
And I guess, and just a question here, do you happen to know offhand what percentage of PPS kids utilize provided transportation? Either TriMet or otherwise? I guess TriMet's harder to know, but how about buses?
The 10,000 number is for students that are provided, not including TriMet. I'd have to find out how many receive the TriMet passes.
Okay. Well, I guess everybody in high school, right?
Everyone in high school receives them, yes.
Okay.
Yeah, my school also doesn't have yellow buses at all, so students either do their own transportation or TriMet.
If there aren't any other transportation questions, I wonder if we could move back a slide. I had some questions around our closed schools and the real estate there. So I know kind of in the community, there's been a conversation around closed schools for years. And one of the things you mentioned here is that the carrying costs for PPS schools, I just noted down the word nominal. Would that be a fair characterization?
Yeah, for a closed site, they're not comparatively a significant cost to maintain those closed buildings.
I see Director Sullivan has something.
Yeah, I just wondered if they're not leasable even, it sounds like, especially Smith, if it's falling apart. Is there any thought of selling that property? Is it worth it, or do we need to hang on to it, or what's the thought?
It's a good question. We have a list of properties that are not being used, so they could conceivably be sold. PPS's policy around disposition of real property, strongly recommends that the district not sell property. And if it does consider selling property, look at options such as long-term leases or something other than that. That said, ultimately, the district and the board can choose to sell properties and has in the past.
Yeah, a long-term lease would probably make more sense. But it's sad when we know we need space to build things, that it just sits there. Okay, thank you.
Mariah, I think you had your hand up, and then I see Dayshell.
I'll give Dayshell a chance and then come back.
Thank you, Mariah. My question is just like around the long-term financial stability. I think that this has been something in the past 3 years, at least that I've been on CBRC, that we've been kind of talking about really highlighting what that long-term sustainability plan is going to be. And I think we've been seeing lots of short-term solutions, but eventually they start to pile up like we're seeing now, and then we kind of keep running from the long-term solution. So is there any kind of strategy around any of the properties that are doing well with maybe some surpluses or anything like that, how they're going to be used in supporting long-term strategies instead of just short-term?
Like, to be more specific, is there a specific property or type of property that you're curious about?
Properties in general. Yeah, just properties in general.
And how you said is your question about revenue generating? I'm sorry, I just wasn't 100% sure of the question. I just want to make sure I'm answering it correctly.
Yeah, so I think for me, it was more about just the long-term sustainability, and kind of hearing your response to the Mariah's question before prompted me to think about like just the long-term sustainability options for PPS's like revenue stream. We've been kind of mentioning this in our CBRC letters each year about long-term sustainability revenue plans, and we kind of keep seeing these like short-term fixes with the budget, it feels like. And so what are those kind of like long-term strategies that are going to be put in place so some of these projects like that, the central HVAC system you talked about, or things like that, can come further down the line?
Yeah, I appreciate that. It's a good question. Particularly when it comes to capital and capital improvements and resources for that, the only real viable option for large sums of resources is general obligation bonds. As I mentioned briefly, the district is pursuing another general obligation bond here in May of this year and has a long-term capital plan that is predicated upon a series of bonds. The plan was ostensibly to go out every 4 years with, I'll just call it overlapping bonds. That means the work in each bond would not be completed in 4 years, but would continue to request for voter approval. That duration of 4 years has been elongated a little bit. So don't anticipate, although that could change, a bond in 4 years from now. But the idea is to be able to continue to generate revenue for capital needs. It will be through continuation of asking for voter approval of general obligation bonds.
Thank you.
Can you, or maybe CFO Morrison, remind us, is that a replacement bond or is that a add-on, the bond that's being proposed in May?
That would be a renewal.
Hey, just a couple more questions on this point about real estate. I've just heard for years and about closing down schools and heard the discussion that closing down schools does not actually save money. I separate this from any other considerations around the issue of closing schools. And I'm just asking about the financials of it here. So the nominal carrying, the cost of carrying a closed school are nominal. What are some of the costs around closing down a school? I mean, are there costs to shutter one? I imagine there are costs to bring something back online, right?
Sure. Is your question, what is the cost if the district were to close a building effectively?
Correct.
That's a good question. I don't have a short answer to that. I mean, certainly we would take a look at whatever is need there. If we would need to if there's fixtures, furniture, and equipment that we would want to relocate, that would have a cost. If there was a need to secure the property in some way, that would have a cost. We could take a look at that. I don't have an estimate of that offhand.
I was just curious because Meek and Kenton were fairly recent.
Mm-hmm. There was no, and there, so Meek was fairly recent. That's on market for lease. And then Kenton, we're currently holding that in case we need to reoccupy it in the near future.
Okay. I have no further questions on this right now. Any of our other committee members? Really want to say thank you for being willing to deep dive with us. As a committee, it's been one of our priorities for many years running to support the maintenance of our schools, for the health of our kids and our teachers, and realizing the long-term cost of not repairing things as we need to, but also recognizing the financial straits of the district presently.
You're happy to be here, and I appreciate your work and your time, of course, the whole committee.
Yeah, thank you so much, Dan. Michelle, is there anything you had while Dan's still here?
No, just thank you, Dan, for being present and covering this and answering questions. And I think Alexander's going to continue to gather questions as they formulate, and as of members who maybe aren't here this evening see this recording, and so that'll come to you. So thank you for your partnership in this.
Hey, so I think, Dan, if you would like to head out, you would be welcome to, or you'd be welcome to stay either way. Sorry, go ahead, Dan, if you were going to say bye.
I will be leaving you now, but if anything, questions come up, I'm happy to answer those later.
Great. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
So the rest of our agenda is really focused on a budget development update. If anyone was able to catch the board work session, our Board of Education received this information or very similar information in their Tuesday work session. So we are now bringing it to this space for our CBRC. And I'd love to pass it over to Michelle to walk us through this content. Thank you.
Thanks, Alexandra. And again, thank you all for being here tonight. There was a team that presented this information to the board on Tuesday night. And some of the things that I'm going to attempt to cover are about staffing of the schools. And in the recording of the board meeting, you will see Dr. Gianfranco go over that part of the material and answer a lot of questions that came up from the board. So I just want you to know I'm going to do my best on those slides, but may not have the answers that the same depth of knowledge that he would have. So we'll start off with our vision for school-based resources. So, our focus has been to maintain investments that have the biggest impact on student outcomes, which means that we're looking across all schools and across the system. We went school by school to see the impact of a variety of different changes in our budget and how those would impact schools. So just that is noted here. And we shifted a little bit more towards school flexibility, and in that means that the principal had a little bit more discretion this year around some of the FTE, full-time equivalencies of the staff allocations to kind of fit the needs of their school in a state of reduction. All right. We're going to dig into the details here. So just before we get into this, I do want to note we had shared an initial list of recommendations that was developed based on feedback from last fall, and that was circulated at the end of January. We, as you can imagine, received a ton of feedback on that information, and so we made some shifts. And as we moved into staffing for our schools, these are some of the things that actually occurred. In the appendix of this slide deck, there's a table that shows kind of comparisons and the shifts. So we have those for reference as well. But we did not raise class size across the board, which is one of the, I don't want to say defaults, but that's one of the biggest levers that a system like ours could adjust to save the largest amount of dollars, is to figure out where can we raise class size here or there. There were some bumps in FTE, some supplemental FTEs that were removed based on school status. So that did occur. We retained strategic school supports. So this is where flexibility comes in the picture, so that principals had some options around how to best support their staff, given their school environment, their school climate, and what their students needs. And so that was a shift in thinking, and we supported principals as they move through their staffing process, kind of thought partners to help them do that. And, we've talked a lot about enrollment decline. It's a challenge that Portland is experiencing at a greater rate than across the state of Oregon. Everyone is experiencing some level of decline, I think, but Portland is ahead of the state. And since, I want to say, I think Dr. Adams shared that 10.6% reduced enrollment since 2020. So definitely hits us in the pocketbook, because we're per student funded for our major state grants and for our general fund, our operating fund, which is 85% staff. We adjusted our preliminary school staffing reductions, adding back 37 FTE. Again, those supplemental supports to schools that were initially recommended to be reduced were added back. and they were offset by additional reductions at the central office and department levels. Our pre-kindergarten programming is continuing at the same level, and the equity formula is not changing. So we received a significant report that informed our equity formula, and I don't have all of the details of that formula, but it helps us determine by school how we should be investing in order to support those students. So I think if you refer back to your budget book, volume 2, you'll see the heat map. Everybody loves the heat map that you can really drill down into each school to see the level of investment that's occurring there, and that's driven by this equity formula. So we were able to keep that intact. All right. There's several slides about staffing, so I think I'm just going to continue through. If you guys get excited about a singular, a single thing, please raise your hand and ask. Otherwise, I'll just continue to talk. So for elementary schools, excuse me, and our K-8 schools, we have introduced some blended classrooms to the upper elementary level. We have had blended classrooms in PPS, but they've not been a focus area for us. And so as our smaller schools, continue to decline in enrollment, there's an opportunity there to do some blends. I will say that the blended classrooms had a lower class size target than the straight grade classroom. So those teachers are going to be receiving additional supports in order to be successful in that environment and also benefit from the teacher perspective with fewer students in their classes. The kindergarten educational assistants are prioritized for the Title I schools, which was a hot topic as well. And then the school-based instructional coach has also been retained. So unfortunately, the IB supports are no longer allocated due to a lack of IB pathways to the upper grades. So that was one of the things that we're moving beyond being able to support at this time. At the middle school, we have a minimum class size of 15 students, and that doesn't lead to a reduction in FTE. What that does is a shift in programming to offload some of those high class sizes in core classrooms. So that's just, again, another way of managing the same resources in a different way, with the thought to improve the student experience and make the most of the teachers in those rooms. So the dual language, immersion, all of the supplemental resources associated with those have been adjusted. Again, enrollment decline impacts the level of supplemental resources that were appropriated. Our Title I supplemental resources are reduced from a base of 2 to 1. I'm not as familiar with what that represents in a school, but if you have further questions about that, I can do a follow-up. And again, the school-based instructional coach and other supplemental resources, those licensed staff that vary in their specialization, those were retained at some level in the schools. All right, thanks, Alexandra. Reading my mind. Oh, you're so good at that. All right, our high school, again, that minimum class size of 15 students has been established. That can be adjusted if a program or a multi-course program is threatened because of dropping below that level. So I know that our senior directors are working with our secondary principals to think through the impact of that. And again, creating a class size minimum in order to kind of readjust those resources, teachers, and offload some of those higher class sizes. There was no, again, across the board targeted increase to class size at the secondary level, which was in the original list of reductions. We had a reduction of career coordinator funded by general fund so that schools have flexibility to select a career college coordinator funded by general fund. I want to definitely note here, thank you, Alexander, for including this point that the college coordinator allocation funded by High School Success remains intact. And so at the board meeting, there was some discussion back and forth on this topic. And so flexibility for the building to determine which was going to better serve students from the general fund, but the High School Success coordinator stays in place. For our multilingual learners, itinerant staff will continue to provide support to schools with fewer students needing needs. And weighting has changed. So all schools receive FTE based on student need. So really that was focused on the newcomer and PISA students getting the highest weight. For special education, I know that this was a topic. I saw that in your report for last year. It's enrollment based, so no significant changes are planned for next year. And that doesn't mean that there won't be changes, but they will be enrollment driven or they will be need driven given what's been identified for the students being served. All right. And our central office preliminary reduction summary. So our personnel and non-personnel budgets will be reduced next year. I don't think that this is a surprise to anyone. This is a multi-year going into the 4th year of this. So even though those non-personnel reductions are in place, I think as we continue to move through the budget development cycle, more information on central office personnel and programs reductions will be made available. And it's not to say that they're not critical too in their own way. They do serve schools, but more in an indirect way. So that will be felt at the school level. It's not just central office, it's all of the departments that work together to coordinate services to serve schools. All right. So this is a graphical representation of what's in the appendix, and you can see our preliminary reductions that went out at the end of January. We had 30%, and we preceded that conversation with the slide that says year after year after year, central office has taken reductions, and so have schools to a point. But our initial recommendation was more heavily weighted towards schools. You can see that here. And given the feedback we received, we went back and took another look. So we have adjusted that back towards central supports and away from schools. And I think you can see that as we went through the staffing slides. And then as you take a peek at those tables in the appendix that show where those changes were. All right, we do have some additional considerations. Unfortunately, our federal programs are being compromised at this time. There's been a lot of discussion about exactly what that might look like, and we are building our guideline in our budget for next year with a 25% reduction in Title I programs, and so this kind of compounds that school-based position change. And that's why I mentioned earlier, we did review a school-by-school picture that showed, including title reductions, like what schools would be impacted by that the most, so that we could be thoughtful in our planning as we added those supplemental supports back. We also have additional federal programs that include professional development for staff. Our nutrition services program is federally funded. Those things are also, we're watching closely, and we have some information here too about federal legislation that may impact us. But right now, in our budget document today, we're planning for a 25% reduction. The other things that may impact schools are sunsetting grants that were already planned to end, and it's just unfortunate timing. Some of those required matches that we no longer have to match, but again, if they funded staff, then schools will see those impacts as well.
I have a quick question about the 25%.
Okay.
Where'd you guys come up with that number? I just got a notification that an executive order was signed today for the removal of the Department of Education, but it also stated that Title I will remain. Um, so did you guys get that information as well? Or and is that where you're getting that 25? Did they reduce the amount of Title I funds? Or I'm just curious of where you got the 25%.
That was an early estimate for us, and I think that we can continue to see new information come all the time from both our federal partners and our state partners. So this was our target, and with the idea that that would be a conservative approach to moving into next year. There was some thought around whether or not that was too much of a reduction. We had other thoughts around this isn't enough. So I would actually invite, I think, Juno, who works closely with Kristen Johnson, to kind of give a little bit more information around that thinking.
And I had sent a list of questions related to programming. I don't know if you received those questions. I'm pretty connected to the community, so a lot of those questions was from the community. So I just wanted to put it on record that those questions have not been answered yet. So I'm just curious if you had received those questions. And because one of the things that you mentioned IB, and that was one of the questions that I had with programs. Like how much funding are we spending with these particular programs, IB, AVID, and some number of other programs as well.
On the question of title, the initial estimates of reductions were based off of the House's proposal for federal programming for education back in December. So in December, the House proposed a 20.5% cut across Title I, and then fully cutting 100% for Title II and Title III. And so that 25% is kind of a blended average of different title programs that the House proposed at that time. While the Senate proposal and the president's proposal pretty much held those budgets flat. Of course, that was back in December. Now that we have a Republican-controlled presidency and Senate as well, what the House proposed is more likely to happen. We don't necessarily know exactly which yet, which other departments may kind of take over for certain buckets of budget for federal funding for schools, because as the Department of Ed is dissolved, the responsibilities for elements of those budgets may likely go to other departments. So with this 25%, this is something that we've kind of stuck to since December, based off of our best knowledge. Other school districts are utilizing other numbers as well. But this is currently, at this time, our best guess of what we can expect. And of course, the more information that comes in over time, the more we'll be able to estimate more accurately.
Thank you. And we did receive your questions. We have not formulated all of the answers yet, but they are in our queue to respond to. So thank you for your questions, and thank you for your support and patience while we work through that. All right.
Were there any other questions right now?
Yeah, I had a question. If you can you go back on the slide? It says schools and specialized programs on that one. So I was curious of what programs were you guys referring to? And then can you go back one more time on the slide? I think one more. It was something that had, I think, IB, and And I was just curious, I think there it is. What was the amount that you guys calculated with that cut will put back into the general fund?
We have, I can speak your question on the specialized programs that included what we see here in multilingual learners, was especially what was also included there. And on the, we do have some detailed tables in our appendix so that you can, I'm not sure if you were able to access these slides yet, but we have some more detailed information here that does help.
Yeah. Yeah,
Right.
you can see right there that it's $500,000 was the estimated savings for that. I think it's on the elementary list. There we go. So yeah, that was a change of 3 positions.
Thank you for that.
It might actually be helpful. Oh, I see Director Sullivan's hand.
Yeah, my question was on that same one. So that's K-5 International Baccalaureate Program. What exactly was that? And you said because there was no pathway or more, or I don't know exactly what that means.
We had some supplemental positions supporting the IB programming. So for example, IB coordinators. We also had some non-personnel budget associated with the International Baccalaureate programming. So supporting their curriculum requirements and any their membership requirements. So it was a mix of non-personnel and personnel.
Okay, so that was supporting it at the K-5 level to prepare them for taking IB in high school? Is that correct?
Yes.
Okay. And then I also saw at one point it said Title I supplemental resources are reduced at a base of 2 to 1. I'm not exactly sure what that means either.
Yeah, thank you for that question. That was the one that I need more information of. And I think that Dr. Franco probably could have answered that in greater depth. So we'll have to follow up with more information on that, unless Juno has some insight from working with his partner, Kristen Johnson. I am not quite sure how that works into this staffing schema.
Okay.
Yeah, I don't have any additional information.
Thank you, Juno. We will capture that question.
Okay, thank you.
So I do think if we have a minute, it might be good to look at those tables to understand the shifts that happened. And initially, Alexander did have them up front and not in the appendix, but now that I'm hearing these questions, I think it's a good idea to show you guys where the movement was made. So you can see here the highlighted areas where we have shifted additional positions from our central office. And again, central office really means departments. So you have to think about Chief Young shared earlier, transportation, facilities, the different types of services that support schools. So we're looking at those areas here, and some there were some add backs as well, but not in the central office. So if we move to the next slide, well, we had one add back there for transportation. But you can see here our elementary school, it didn't shift because the only changes here were in the reductions due to enrollment. And then that shift for kindergarten assistants. So a kindergarten classroom in a Title I school would need 20 kids in it in order to have an additional instructional assistant in the room. So that shift is happening. Our KA schools, similarly, it's an enrollment decline that's driving the reduction in staff, and that's a pretty standard practice. as districts right size their staffing to meet enrollment. You can see that again here. We have, I'm sorry, you can go ahead. We have the Title I supplemental staffing. So that was additional general fund staffing that we were offering to the Title I schools that we were pulling back. It was not a federal requirement to have those staff there. Again, it was additional supports when we had resources available to do that. Initially here in high school, you can see that the plan to change the staffing formula to increase that by one student would have provided $2.8 million worth of savings. That's where it's talking about kind of being a big lever for meeting a budgetary shortfall kind of across the board, and that was added back, and a reduction of some classified staffing positions. All right.
Director Sullivan, do you have your hand up from your prior question, or do you have another question?
I forgot.
All right, so in this slide, you can see the multiple school levels, those supplemental staff that were originally reduced with a projected savings of $10.4 million. Again, our target was $40 million. And so we were looking at things that could potentially meet that goal without impacting classrooms. But based on the feedback we received, 32 positions were added back here. And then again, those blended classrooms primarily at the 4th and 5th grade level, where we noticed that there were some very small class sizes, and an opportunity to recover some of that resource and make it more whole there. And then the program balancing pool of administrators, that was something that initially took a much greater reduction and then was added back. And again, that's to support school leadership and teachers in buildings. So that's our table. So you guys, I'm sure we'll go over this with a little bit more care and have additional questions. Okay. Thank you, Alexandra, for the bird walk there.
I think that was a good use of time. Thank you, Michelle, for walking us through all of this. Mariah, feel free.
Considering that we are probably we're in a biennium budget and at the legislature, and assuming enrollment trends continue, and we know we have contractual obligations, what does the budget gap look like for next year? Can you remind us?
Well, this is the budget gap for next year.
Excuse me, for the following year.
For the following year,
27. Yeah,
we're still working through those numbers, and it's really going to be determined by the level of appropriation we get from the legislature. Right now we're looking at probably $40 million again. So moving into that over the course of next year, we're going to be probably looking more carefully at some systemic changes that we can do. I think that's to be determined. I'm a little bit new in this role to overshare what I don't know for sure. I think there's going to be a lot more discussions at the community level regarding kind of that longer term vision for staffing in schools. I appreciated the question earlier about the cost of closing a school, and when I reflect on that and some of the schools that we have and the number of students in them, as we have to kind of thin the amount of staff in those schools, it's when you close a school and you move the staff and students to another school, it creates a more vibrant, enriching environment, I think, for everyone. And so there's some thought in there, and I'm not a proponent of consolidation or boundary changes or any of that, but I have seen that in our feedback as well, for us to create kind of a longer term vision for what that looks like as our enrollment continues to change. It's projected to change for the next 14 years. So, and unless something significant happens, we're going to have to think broadly and longer term around how to make sure that our students and staff are best supported in the facilities that we have. Oh, I saw a hand up there.
Yeah, can you explain where it says program balancing pool of administrators? Like, what does that mean?
Yeah, again, that's another probably instructional leadership shift that happens. I think that we have some administrators that are dispatched to support schools on behalf of, to assist principals in supporting their schools. And I think that that is what that is referring to. So making sure that we have people that are like ready to go or have an interim period in a building during a time of need throughout the year. And Alexandra and Juno, if you're more familiar with that term and the use of that FTE, please jump in.
These are our assistant and vice principals that are allocated to schools.
So we have certain thresholds for schools where if we have too many students, the principal may need additional support in one form or another. So yes, assistant principals and vice principals.
Can you explain the thought behind why 400,000 was considered to be a reduction from the what is it, the racial equity portion? Yeah, racial equity social justice partnership contracts versus like other programming that we have through the district. I was just curious of what was the thought behind that, and how does it compare to like other programs like IB, for example, which was 500,000 that we are looking to cut. Yeah, I'm just curious.
From the conversations I was a part of, that was really looking at a 10% reduction. We were looking at our non-personnel, so non-district staff, even though I know that our racial equity and social justice partnership contracts provide people that are in our schools and support our students. So we were looking at those kind of across the board. So that was the thought behind it, was to look at our contract services as well as our staff, which are a much smaller part of our budget. But that was the approach here. And we went from a 10% reduction. You can see that that had a shift. I don't know that that answers your question.
No,
we
not really.
were charged. Yeah, I'm sorry.
Are there other questions right now? I think this is a lot to take in, and I know that this wasn't available to you, you know, well in advance of the meeting. We're moving really quickly behind the scenes and making everything ready. So thank you for your grace and patience tonight. And as questions surface for you, we will add them to our list and do our best to respond to you as soon as we can, and especially in advance of our April 24th meeting as much as we can. Mariah, did you have any other questions right now or comments?
Don't have any other questions right now. I will say I really appreciate PPS and you know, Chief Morrison making the numbers available as quickly as possible to us. It really helps me, particularly being kind of a visual person, to be able to talk through and see these. So thank you for that. We've got a lot of work to do here as a committee. Thank you. I believe this is the last item on our agenda tonight, and I don't have any other business I think we need to cover. I would just say let's make sure to pull those dates out and put them specifically in an email. I know that you've put them in agendas and things like that, but for everyone. So
Absolutely.
I'll be getting those invites too.
Yes, I will send invites, and I'll be sending out our meeting recording to our CBRC members. And the next time we'll be communicating over email, and you'll have our budget document. We'll be sending that as soon as we can. Our next date that you should be aware of was the April 22nd superintendent's proposed budget release, where you can optionally attend if you choose to. And then otherwise, our next meeting is on April 24th. And I'll turn it over to you, Mariah, if you'd like to adjourn our meeting.
Yeah, thank you everyone for being here tonight. Thank you especially to our PPS staff who work so hard to support us here. I appreciate you. And let's adjourn a little early here. Thank you. Good night.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, everybody.